What's going on, y'all? Movie Man Mikey here, and March 2024 has come and gone, so now it's time to rank the new releases I saw. While I technically saw 15 new releases in the month, I'll only be talking about 13 of them here. One of them, I was playing catch up with a movie from February, stop motion. I got the chance to see that in theaters, and that was a pretty cool horror movie. And thanks to AMC's Scream Unseen, I got the chance to see an early release of the movie Sting, but because that comes out April 12th, I figured I'd save that for the April 2024 rankings. Without further ado, let's hop right into the list now, starting off with Knox Goes West, the second directorial effort from Michael Keaton. He's also leading the film here as a contract killer riddled with dementia, setting out on one final mission to protect his son. On paper, there is some intrigue to that concept. In execution, however, this just made for an incredibly dull and lifeless watch. My personality is pretty hyperbolic in general, but I truly mean it when I say this is one of the most boring films I've ever seen in theaters. Michael Keaton's talents as an actor speak for themselves far more than I ever could, but in the director's chair, he is not suited well. Every shot here feels like it's lingering for like an absurdly awkward amount of time, though I guess it is consistent with the film's terrible editing. And then you got talented performers rounding out the supporting cast like Al Pacino, James Marsden, and Marcia Gay Harden, but even their stories are more sidelined as we focus on this generic not even B tier, D tier investigation story. There is a payoff of some sort in the end, but it is not worth making the painful near 2-hour excursion there. So that's why Knox Goes Away lands here in last place. Number 12 on my list is gonna be Imaginary, the newest conveyor belt horror film from Blumhouse. From the trailer alone, I knew I was not gonna be a fan of this. You know, you got the intense shots of an inanimate teddy bear. And then also seeing the name Jeff Wadlow on the screen definitely did not do anything for me. I think I've seen his last 4 movies, none of which I enjoy. And judging by its placement here, clearly I did not enjoy this one much either. The characters in this movie, I mean, people do not act like real people. The exchange of dialogue between characters is just inauthentic. Specifically, there's a scene here where the next door neighbor tries to woo the older daughter by like showing her, hey, you want to take some drugs? Only for at the end of the scene for it to be revealed, oh, it's just allergy meds, and it's like a funny joke. So that's like the level of writing we're working with. The boundless creativity of this concept is unfortunately squandered by Blumhouse's low production model where they're not really spending too much money on anything. And the third act is where this is most noticeable, as the final set piece feels more like a subpar Goosebumps episode as opposed to an actual movie. DeWanda Wise as the lead here is probably the best aspect, but even her efforts cannot save this lackluster final product. So it is for those reasons that Imaginary is here, and number 12. In the number 11 spot for me is Arthur the King, the latest entry in sterilized, overly sentimental canine cinema. So directors Simon Sealand-Jones and Mark Wahlberg had just previously teamed up for The Family Plan, which came out late last year on Apple TV, and this is definitely another more family-oriented movie as we follow a washed-up racer on his final chance to win a world championship. And of course, the title comes from the dog that joins them midway through, who's also adding fuel to the fire while also helping strengthen their friendship. As cynical as that summary may have been, I have enjoyed films like Max and A Dog's Purpose in the past, so I was expecting the same outcome here. Maybe my opinion of those would change on a rewatch though, because the sappy, heavy-handed nature of the script here was just endlessly annoying to me. There are a handful of credits on Mark Wahlberg's filmography that I do adore, but his performance here as this pretty much perfect lead is very flat and just uninteresting. Someone who I wasn't expecting to see here whatsoever is Simu Liu, but he's actually putting a lot of effort into his role, probably more than the movie should have. I just could not get over how hokey everything was. All that said, I wouldn't be too surprised if it later came out that this movie was AI written, so for all those reasons and more, it is why Arthur the King is here and number 11. We're now getting into the top 10, but that doesn't mean the quality of movies much changes, because in the number 10 spot is Kung Fu Panda 4. I did previously share my thoughts on this in my video that ranked the entire franchise, where this movie ended in last place for me, and as someone who would consider themselves a fan of the original trilogy, this 8-year comeback felt like a pointless and almost insulting endeavor. Right out the gate, you have the Furious 5, they are not in the movie, they're gone on their own mission because duty calls whatever. I was already kind of turned off by that. And then knowing that Poe has to eventually find a dragon warrior, and then you see the trailer with Awkwafina's Fox character, you more than likely know where this is going. And again, I'll reiterate, I do not hate Awkwafina, but her voice performance here is terrible. She goes through an arc that is just completely not earned whatsoever as well, and it was just very annoying. With each of the previous installments touting fantastic villains, Viola Davis as the chameleon here is also another big letdown. Her motivation is weak, and for the power she possesses, she is not nearly as imposing as she should be. The animation here also felt like a downgrade as well. I mean, it's one thing to mention the budget is slashed in half of what the cheapest of the original three is, but specifically there was one action sequence that was visualized through black and white silhouettes as opposed to like the colorful, vibrant atmosphere, which just left me like, why? 3 months into watching movies this year, as tough as it is to say, Kung Fu Panda 4 is definitely the most disappointing release I've seen so far, so that's why it lands here at number 10. Coming in the number 9 spot for me is going to be Cabrini, the newest film from director Alejandro Gomez Monteverde. This is his third release following 2015's Little Boy and Sound of Freedom just last year, which garnered quite the controversy. Setting aside all the political stuff behind the scenes and everything, I thought it was a decent enough movie exploring a subject that doesn't really get much light shed on it in mainstream media. And similarly, the narrative of Cabrini is viewed through a religious lens as we follow this Italian immigrant in her mission to help those less fortunate. I had literally not seen a single trailer for this movie before heading in. I just went to go see it because I heard it was that guy's next movie, and I was like, why not? And while I could see an argument for this being a technically better made movie, I can't deny enjoying Sound of Freedom more. This is an aggressive, and I mean aggressive, slow burner, clocking in at almost 2.5 hours, and the lack of nuance across the script left me feeling disconnected from the story from like a large majority. It's also not the biggest sin in the world, but it's also worth mentioning the score is so overtly emotionally manipulative, the scenes are never able to just speak for themselves. So with all the aforementioned negatives, why is it as high as it is on this list? Well, it's really for a few reasons, including some eye-catching costumes and production design, and some decent performances all around. Christina Delana does a great job as the hard-working, unstoppable lead, while David Morse and somehow John Lithgow appear in supporting roles that I thought were decent. So it is for those reasons that Cabrini comes in at number 9. Number 8 on my list is The Prank, a new high school comedy seeing two students seeking vengeance on the iconic Rita Moreno as a vicious school teacher. This did premiere at South by Southwest a couple years back, but it didn't get a wider theatrical release until last month. And unfortunately, the potential contained within the absurd premise ends up being played way too safe for a vast majority. Playing the duo of friends here are Connor Kalopsis and Ramona Young, both actors whom I'm not too familiar with. And the effort they're putting into working off each other is unquestionable. I just will say it did feel like two actors acting rather than two characters naturally talking more often than not. As mentioned earlier, Rita Moreno plays the insufferable teacher here, and she is relishing in the spotlight across all of her screen time. For as short as this movie is, it is kind of frustrating and a bummer that most of the runtime is spent meandering, slowly building up to a decent enough payoff by the end, I'll say. Even so, I'm not sure if or when I'd be wanting to revisit this for a laugh down the line. So that's why The Prank comes in at number 8 for me. Coming in at number 7 for me is going to be Ricky Stanicky, Peter Farrelly's latest comedy streaming on Amazon Prime. While I haven't seen all the films from him and his brother, I do enjoy the 3 that I've seen from them. And yes, this does include 2014's Dumb and Dumber 2, which I don't care. I enjoy that movie. I missed out on the greatest beer run ever from 2021, which also had Zac Efron, so I would say I was looking forward to this pretty decently. And for better or worse, this is the exact kind of generic, raunchy comedy that is promised by the trailer. As the friend trio, Zac Efron, Andrew Santino, and Jermaine Fowler aren't the most believable group of friends, but they did have better camaraderie than I was expecting. For most of its marketing, whether it's the posters or the trailer, the headlining name here seems to be John Cena, and he is by far the strongest aspect. That mainly comes from his immense dedication as well, because it's not like I was laughing at all of his jokes, but the dedication that he has to just playing these absurd, goofy characters is respectable for sure. With the laughs not being super consistent though, it only further brought into question why this movie was almost 2 hours as opposed to your typical comedy runtime of 80 to 100 minutes. All of that being said, it did make for a tolerable enough viewing experience I could see watching again with some friends in the future, so that's why Ricky Stanicky lands at number 7 for me. Number 6 on my list, can't believe it's this high, Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2. I'm just as shocked as everyone else. The original release of Blood and Honey last year was met with scathing criticism around really every corner, myself included. For as poorly put together as it is though, I did enjoy a few of the kills. So when the trailer for this new one dropped, looking more polished up, having a writer with a previously respected credit, like many people, my curiosity was piqued. so much so that I went to see this in theaters. And I was shocked to actually enjoy myself a decent amount this time around. Don't get it twisted, at the end of the day, it is still a low-budget horror movie adapting childhood characters into grimy villains, but at the very least, there is an actual effort here to establish lore when it comes to the memories of Christopher Robin, who's also a character we're able to resonate with a lot stronger here thanks to the recasting of Scott Chambers. Funny enough, the extensive lore might be a little too ambitious, which I never thought I'd say for this movie. When it comes to the kills, I'll say the ones in the original are really mean-spirited, and the ones here still retain some of that, but the deaths are thankfully more goofy and over-the-top than self-serious, which I could definitely appreciate. The rave sequence in specific towards the end was highly enjoyable to watch unfold. We're also introduced to some new characters here in the universe with Owl and Tigger. It's been spoken to death now how like horror icons like Freddy and Michael Myers went into the establishment of these characters, and considering all that, I'm still not entirely sure whether or not I love the choice to have them speak. By the end though, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued with what the Poohniverse had in store. So it is for all of those reasons that Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2 ends up in my number 6 spot. If you would have told me that a year ago, never would have believed you. Now heading into the top 5, at my number 5 spot is Immaculate, aka the horror movie where Sydney Sweeney plays a nun. In my review, I talked about how I'm not typically the biggest fan of the religious horror subgenre. It comes off more boring than anything most of the time to me, but this one seemed like an easy enough watch as it was less than 90 minutes. And while it does fall into that paint-by-number story structure by slowly building tension over the first hour that's almost like tiresome, the story does eventually culminate to a most interesting point with an off-the-wall final 20 minutes where the effects also reach their peak. As much as I've enjoyed Sydney Sweeney and her previous works in the past, it was disappointing to say that one of the least likable elements here to me was her performance. Not for a lack of effort, but I just could not buy her as this vulnerable character, especially when it really mattered in those final 20 minutes. Because if we're going to be honest, the way this movie ends, the shot it ends on, is supposed to be terrifying, but I found myself more so chuckling. Most of, if not all of the horror here comes from incredibly lazy and cheap jump scares that I can't remember the last time I've seen jump scares this lazy since The Woman in Black. All around though, this was slightly better than I was expecting it to be, so that's why Immaculate lands in my number 5 spot. Getting into my number 4 pick, I'd rate all of these next films either a 3 or higher, and we're going to start off that list with Late Night with the Devil. If it wasn't for Shudder being confident enough in bringing this original release to theaters, I'm not sure I would have checked it out, but I'm glad I did. The movie immerses itself in the aesthetic of a late night 70s talk show for its entire 90-minute run, which you would think is a pretty big risk, especially considering its confined location. I mean, it starts off with some admittedly lazy exposition detailing our lead's backstory, but due mainly to a great lead performance from David Dastmalchian, I found myself buying into the universe immediately from the jump. That's not to say the film is always effective, as the terror and entertainment definitely varies with the guests that are brought on the show. One performance though that has to be mentioned here in my opinion is Ingrid Torelli as the possessed little girl who, the second she came on screen, I genuinely had felt uneasy. And it's been a debate online for a little bit now whether or not the cheap look of the visuals here are intentionally adding to the aesthetic. For me personally, that was definitely a more frustrating element, and the lack of a proper conclusion had also definitely left me rolling my eyes when the credits came. But overall, it made for such a breezy watch that I wouldn't mind tossing on to watch again, so that's why Late Night with the Devil lands here at number 4. Coming in at number 3 on my list is Snack Shack, a nice coming-of-age flick throwing viewers back to the 90s. I'm a sucker for the coming-of-age genre, whether we're talking about Perks of Being a Wallflower, Superbad, or The Kings of Summer. The list could honestly go on forever. So I was immediately intrigued when I saw the trailer for this a couple months back. If nothing else, what really sold me to see this was Gabriel LaBelle in the irreverent supporting friend role, as he just delivered an incredibly endearing performance in The Fabelmans. Looking to make some cash in the summer, he and Connor Sherry, who does pretty good in his first ever performance, have the bright idea of running a poolside snack shack. On a surface level, the components for me to fall in love with a story like this are there. In execution, however, the film feels immensely stifled by the introduction of Mika Abdullah's character, as her developing romance with one of the boys takes center stage for the film's second and third acts. Seriously, with how underwritten and cliche the unfolding romance was, it almost felt like a whole new team of writers stepped in for this second second half. Nick Robinson also shows up here in a very small supporting role, and I thought he was fine, but the way that they ended his character's arc kind of felt half-baked to me. I cannot stress enough how excited I was to have found by far my favorite movie of the year watching the first 20-30 minutes of this, but with the second half almost completely dropping the ball for me, this ended up just being a fine film, so that's why it's here at number 3. In the runner-up spot for me is going to be Love Lies Bleeding, the first A24 movie I was able to check out in 2024. Here, we follow the romance between a gym owner and bodybuilder as the two fall deeper into the small town's criminal underworld on the way to compete. I remember seeing this trailer show up in my subscriptions as I'm a massive fan of A24, but I didn't think too much about it until I started to see all the positivity pour in. Seeing it for myself, I was very surprised and pleased with the final product. It really hinges on the dynamic of Kristen Stewart and Katie O'Brien, and the romance here is something that I definitely believe the second the two cross paths. With any relationship, there are ups and downs, yet the chemistry sustained by the two throughout never seems to falter. Dave Franco plays a small role here that is far different than pretty much anything I've ever seen him in before, and he does a pretty good job. And then of course we have Ed Karras here playing a character with a lot more depth than I expected going in, and he's really good as well. The final 15 to 20 minutes provides some answers that I feel would have been better left unanswered, and I could have done without the experimental approach of the finale for sure. All in all though, this is definitely one of the stronger films that I've seen this year, so that is why it lands in the number 2 spot for the March 2024 film rankings. But coming in first place shouldn't be much of a shock to anyone following this last month of film. It's gotta be Dune Part 2. I will be totally honest, it did take me 2 viewings of this movie to fully appreciate and be confident with having it as my number 1 film of the year. The sheer amount of further world and conflict exploration is a lot to take in, and I'm sure there's some elements that I still do not fully understand. But knowing what I was in for on a second watch, I definitely think that made things more digestible. One thing consistent across both viewings though, regardless, was the incredible technical prowess on screen. First we have the breathtaking cinematography captured once again by Greg Fraser. The biggest takeaway for me, however, was the insanely maybe the most immersive sound design I've seen in any movie, as both times I saw it, I will not forget the actual literal shaking in my seats that happened. While it isn't a huge portion of the runtime, us getting to see Paul travel on these sandworms really does feel like an out of this world spectacle. Timothée Chalamet, of course, is assuming the leading role once again, and I will admit, I did enjoy his character more in the last movie. It wasn't until the final 40 or so minutes of this one that I really started to embrace him. And then we also, of course, have Zendaya getting more screen time in this movie. She does a great job. As more time has passed, though, being completely honest, I didn't completely feel like the relationship between her and Chalamet felt entirely natural. Austin Butler is probably the most memorable new character we meet here. He does a great job playing this raging savage. It's definitely a nice change up from what he just gave us in Elvis. While my resonance with the film might not be as strong as others, I'm still shocked to see that this is number 15 on the Letterboxd Top 250. I still did enjoy it enough to say that I'm excited for if and when a third installment comes. So that is why Dune Part 2 is my favorite film not only of March 2024, but of the year so far. So that finishes my rankings for all the new releases last month. I also have this list up on Letterboxd, which you can once again check out down below, as well as my opinion on thousands of other movies. And now it's time to sound off in the comments. What movies did you love this month? What movies did you hate this month? What movies did you see this month? Whatever you have to say, it should be a fun discussion down there. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks a ton for making it to the end of this video. I've been Movie Man Mikey, and always remember, enjoy yourself.